afternoon. This project is an attempt to provide empirical data on the effects on charities of COVID and particularly of the measures designed to contain it. Now, the initial stages of the pandemic were marked by predictions of an unprecedented disruption. So we had headlines to do with the biggest financial crisis facing organisations in living memory, a consistent and widespread challenge, a perfect storm in which organisations were being stretched to breaking point. How might you predict or judge the impacts of a crisis such as this? Much of the evidence on which the above quotes were based drew on small-scale surveys of organisations' perceptions or expectations. In this project, we've used administrative evidence from the Charity Commission for three reasons. The first is that when we're trying to explore questions of financial vulnerability, this gives us actual reported figures, not perceptions or expectations, not questions like anticipating a large reduction in income or a significant increase in expenditure. The data is regularly updated. At the time we did this analysis, we had around 49,000 reports for charities for financial years ending at least 3 months beyond the initial lockdown, and there's probably several thousand more available now. And we can bolt the regularly updated feeds from the Charity Commission of data on incomes and expenditures onto around 20 years of the financial history data that we already have available on charities since at least 1997. So that gives us a much more informed longitudinal perspective on how serious the situation is. There are various measures of what is of ways of measuring what is happening. First of all, here we use two measures of financial vulnerability as developed in the North American non-profit literature to capture the numbers of organisations experiencing disruptions over and above a particular threshold. Then we calculate indicators of the relative growth rates of charities and show how those measures have evolved over time. That enables us to focus on particular parts of the distribution. And finally, we look at the relationship between some indicators we've constructed of financial vulnerability and the question of whether or not organisations were in receipt of grants to alleviate the challenges of COVID. So the first indicator we use here is the extent to which organisations experience an excess of expenditure over their income in any given financial year. So the horizontal axis is time starting in 1997 and the vertical axis is the proportion of organisations by income size bands for which expenditure exceeded income by at least 25% in each year. So for the smallest organisations, which is the the blue line at the top of the graph here, in fact there looks to be a steady worsening of the position over time. Over this 23-year period, the proportion of organisations experiencing that 25% just about doubles. For the next size band down, incomes of between £10,000 and £25,000, this proportion increases initially, but then levels off after the recessionary period around 2008 and to 10. We do seem to get some signs of an uptick, particularly for the smallest organisations, when we have financial years ending after March 2020. That's less pronounced for larger entities. So this, and at the upper end of the size distribution, the picture is broadly flat over time. Our second indicator is to look at trends in income over a 3-year period. What is the proportion of organisations that report a reduction in their incomes of 25% over 3 years? All the data in here are inflation adjusted, and what we do is compare the income in a given year, say 2000, with what the income was 3 years earlier, and if there's and we're looking for the proportion of organisations that experience that 25% reduction. I think you'd probably agree the dominant feature of this graph is the bump around the Great Recession. It's very obvious for financial years ending in 2009, 2010 and 11 compared to 3 years previously. The proportion spikes. It reaches over 35% for at the lower end of the size distribution. It's perhaps less pronounced again for some of the bigger organisations. And it's not a single year spike either. Things actually appear to get worse over a few years and then gradually subside as organisations return to a better position. It's also notable that on this index you seem to see a little bit of a dip, perhaps a return to previous levels around 2015, 2016, but then some signs of evidence of instability and a worsening situation prior to 2020, and then of course, as you might expect, a very sharp jump as we start to get financial returns for 2020, such that up here there's around 40% of the smallest organisations experiencing a downturn of 25% or more, comparing their income in 2020 at this point with what it was in 2017. And perhaps there's no great surprise in some of that. Many of the smaller entities are going to be the kinds of organisations that rely very heavily on face-to-face activities of various kinds, all of which would generally tend to take place in the spring and summer and early autumn of the year, and of course that kind of activity was completely shut off as a result of lockdown measures. Now, one point that you might make about figures such as these is that they just tell us the proportion of organisations that have cleared a threshold of some kind. They don't tell us by how much they've cleared it. So what we could have is a situation in which there's broadly the same percentage of organisations experiencing these 25% blips, for want of a better word, but for some of them the position is actually very much worse indeed. There could be subgroups that are doing far worse than these figures would imply. And that's what leads us into work on the pattern of relative growth in resources of charities. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that here. We calculate for each year, for each charity, the percentage growth or decline in resources, incoming resources that an organisation has had. We rank them from top to bottom. So imagine charities lined up in order of their growth, with lowest growth rates at one end and highest growth rates at the other. And we take the median, which is the growth rate of the middle charity. And in the illustrations I've got, we take the 25th percentile. So that's the value at which 25% of charities lie below it and 75% of them lie above it. And what this is beginning to focus on, more than those summary figures, particularly when we look at the 25th percentile, is organisations at the extremes, at the lower end certainly, of the growth distribution. So I'll now illustrate what we've done with this. We've got two figures plotted here for each year. The shaded in symbols show growth rates, the median growth rate unadjusted for inflation, for figures that aren't adjusted for inflation, and the unshaded circles are real terms changes. So in the early 2000s, with an index of 1, meaning that a charity experiences zero growth, in the early 2000s, in cash terms, there was fairly steady increases in the resources of the charity experiencing the median growth rate, but in real terms, they were just kind of keeping their head above water, maybe up to 1, nearly 2% in some years. But there is a notable dip around the recessionary period, particularly in the real terms figures. An index of 0.96 means, in effect, real terms reduction of 4%. And it takes a few years, which is kind of consistent with the earlier graph showing that bump around the recession period. It takes a few years to get back to somewhere near where the figure was in the early 2000s. And then what happens in 2020 is a very substantial reduction in income in real terms. So the median charity experienced a drop in income of approximately 15% in real terms. It's a figure just below 0.86 down here. And it's very striking that compared to it's a dramatic single year drop, much more so than was the case in the recessionary period. And then the figure, if anything, is even more dramatic when we look at the 25th percentile. These are organisations which are experiencing, in effect, real terms reductions. The typical income at this stage of the place in the distribution drops by something of the order of 16% or so in any given year, even prior to the recession. In the recessionary period at the 25th percentile, it's a year-on-year drop of around 20%. But at this point in the distribution in 2020, organisations are experiencing approximately a reduction in resources of over 40%, indicated by the figure of 0.6 here. So a quarter of organisations are experiencing that scale of reduction in resources in 2020. And that's differentiated too by size of organisation. So if we focus on the real terms reductions, for example, at the bottom end of the income distribution, of the size distribution, the 25th percentile is a reduction of approximately 50% in real terms in 2020. That's much greater than in the recession period, where at this point in the size distribution of organisations, it's more like 20% around 2009. It's slightly less bad as we move up the size distribution of organisations, where we've got charities with incomes greater than £10 million and greater than £1 million. It is better, but it's still not great, because the 25th percentile here still signals a reduction of around 13% in resources. So a significant tail of organisations at all points in the size distribution experiencing very substantial reductions of organisations. These are the 25th percentile. So in looking at all these graphs, it's important to keep in mind that means a quarter of organisations are doing worse than that. One final point on this is to look at whether this is related in any way to receiving government funding. Now, this hasn't been a requirement of reporting to the Charity Commission until quite recently, but we have got data for 5 financial years on it. And all we've done here is plot the relative growth rate in charities' income by whether or not organisations were receiving government funding in the years running up to the pandemic. And I think you can see pretty clearly there the organisations that weren't receiving government funding were entirely privately funded. Their position is dramatically worse than those that were receiving government money. Now, this is not, and it's important to emphasise this is not capturing the impact of funds made available by the government since the pandemic began. These are financial reports for periods ending up to late 2020. So we'll see what happens with those organisations in the years to come. So key findings about this are the decline in incomes around 2020 are remarkable and worth emphasising that these are different in scale and nature from even the Great Recession of 10, 11 years ago. The scale is plainly at least twice as great as anything appearing in the graphs I've shown around 2009 to 10. We do see a dip, but nothing on a scale that happens in 2020, and there's certainly no precedent for a single year decline of anything like this kind. So I've given some broad brush illustrations from this which do highlight some particularly adverse changes at the bottom end of the distribution, which to some degree help confirm the highly pessimistic projections of the early months of the pandemic. They also point towards the need for much more understanding of things like the income mix of organisations, which we've discussed in a previous presentation to do with this project, and we think that these reductions are most likely to be concentrated in organisations, as you might expect, relying very heavily on face-to-face interactions that were effectively cut off at source by the lockdown measures. So finally, some brief points on the use of these indicators in making decisions about which organisations to support. One question we might, for example, want to ask is the extent to which the awards made since the spring of 2020 to support organisations by various funders, including government, go to the organisations that had been in the most vulnerable position financially. We've got data on 13,940 charities that received grants of one kind or another, and the question we ask here is how they compare to the charity population as a whole. Note that we don't have data on applicants, so comparing with the broader population of charities is the only comparison we can make. So organisations that got grants were more likely to be larger. Only 15% had incomes of £25,000 or less, for example, and they were 2.5 times as likely than the rest of the charity population to be charitable companies. They did, where we could investigate this, have lower levels of reserves than other charities, but it seems from our indicators that their prior experience of financial vulnerability was actually better than the wider population of charities. So if the sole reason for making grants was to do with prior financial vulnerability and the likely impacts on finances of COVID, then you might argue that some of the indicators didn't indicate a particularly good match. But on the other hand, perhaps this is consistent with the view that many grants were made with the aim of stabilising larger organisations, perhaps those deemed capable of playing a longer term role in communities. So to conclude, this longitudinal data is crucial because it helps us place the present times in context. In previous periods since the late 90s, we do see some of the challenges of an economic downturn. We do see signs of some periods when conditions were worsening. But we've not previously had situations in which at least half of organisations have faced reductions of around 20% of their budgets, or in which a quarter of them were losing nearly a half. There's clearly more work that could be done on this in terms of looking at explanations for vulnerability, in terms of exposure to particular income streams and or the presence of government funding, perhaps acting as a stabiliser for charity finances. And this all highlights the need for a disaggregated perspective that is sensitive to the diverse experience of particular organisations. Thank you.